That Jews felt themselves to be Germans, and often they were extremely patriotic Germans. And typically, very typically, I would hear, my family has been here for hundreds of years. I'm as much German as anybody else is. Just because I'm Jewish, I didn't even, some people say I learned from Hitler that I was a Jew. I didn't think about being a Jew. And others were more observant and were Jewish, but generally they felt very closely integrated into German society. They were proud of being, they called it Frontkämpfer, fighting at the front during the First World War, not so long before the Second World War. And they fought very bravely, won Iron Crosses. Very often, powerful image to me is that some of the older men who would go off and be deported, they would walk with their Iron Crosses on their breast as they went to the train station, taking them to Auschwitz and so on. I know of exact cases of this. It happened frequently. And they were proud to be Germans and couldn't believe that the people that they'd lived with for so many years were somehow gone crazy, and they thought they were their friends, or at least they were as German as anybody else. But then the other thing is, if you think about it, it has very much to do with your age and your situation. If you're a family father or mother, and you think, and you've got a job as a banker or as a businessman or as a teacher or a lawyer or whatever, you think, well, what country am I going to? I don't speak Spanish. I don't want to go to Bolivia. How am I going to start all over again now that I'm 45, 50, 55, 60, or 40 years old? Maybe as a young person, when you're 18 or something, it was perhaps easier to go. Some people told me it was like an adventure. Some of the younger people who went off on these so-called child transport, kinder transports, to England after Kristallnacht in 1939, mostly is when this happened. Some 10,000 Jewish children were sent and taken to England and left their parents and so on. For many of them, it was very tearful, of course, but a lot of them described it as a kind of adventure. They didn't understand the full ramifications, that they'd never see their parents again, which is usually the case. But with the more, typically, the situation was people didn't want to start a new job. How can I support myself? What can I do in this other place? This is where I'm from. Why should I leave this country? And most, I think, wanted to believe at least, that somehow their friends, their neighbors, the country, they would finally come back to their senses and Hitler would be gone. But you also have to remember from the timing is that if you're talking about the 1930s, when most people left, once Kristallnacht came, that was getting near the end. But by 1939, in the fall, the war started right? So they were in France in September of 1939, the Germans. And by that time, it became almost impossible to leave. But some decided to go, others stayed. The majority left of German Jews. Of German Jews, the majority left. But still, about 150,000 of originally maybe 550, 600,000, depending upon if you count half Jews, full Jews, all these kind of German Nazi terminology. It's maybe a quarter stayed, okay, and didn't leave, even when they had seen synagogues burning throughout Germany and Kristallnacht and so on. They still didn't know that the Holocaust would happen. In 1939, even then, even though many Jews had been killed, when I say many, hundreds perhaps, it wasn't millions. So most people couldn't imagine, most Jewish people, and probably even most Germans in 1939 or earlier, that there was going to be a Holocaust. We know now, sure. But in 1939, at that time, or 38 or 37, they knew things were bad, but they didn't know it would get that bad. They didn't know that Hitler really would be that crazy, that he would kill the Jews, and that the people of Germany and other countries would actually be willing to be involved in the process to make it happen. If you read Mein Kampf, in which he wrote back in 1925, is My Struggle, I'm not sure what it is in French, you know, when he was in jail after his first attempt to take over the country in 1923, we call it the Beer Hall Putsch, the attempted coup d'etat or something. And he went to jail after being tried, and he had a light jail sentence, but he spent a year, and then he dictated his autobiography and his views of the party and the movement to his secretary, Rudolf Hess, in Landsberg Fortress, south of Munich, where he was. Well, if you can read in this, you know, that he was going to have a reckoning. He was going to deal with the Jews. But usually people would interpret that to mean, I'm going to deal with them hard, I'm going to be rough to them. But, I mean, it seemed crazy to most people. Hitler then, you know, in 1923, I mean, the man is only 34 years old. I mean, he's born in 1889. He had no party support. Nobody really supported him. He didn't even have 2% of the people that would vote for his Nazi party in the elections, not until the breakthrough election in 1930. So they had no reason to believe that this man was just anything other than a crazy guy, kind of a difficult one from a very fringe small party. But whether Hitler even believed it was possible, I don't know. But I don't know that I think nobody knows. We can't get in his mind exactly. My own guess is, I don't think he knew. He then told me about being involved in killing Jews by shooting them with revolvers in the head. He was with a small group. He was a kind of policeman. He was a kind of SS auxiliary. He was a kind of guy in the SS, as he said. He was originally a regular policeman, and in this he was, in 1943, I believe it was, he explained about one detail where he went out with a group of 5 other policemen and killed 300 women, children, and older people. And and I asked him, how'd you do this? And he said, with revolvers. This group didn't have machine guns. They only had revolvers, he said. And he said, yeah, we shot them, you know. And in one afternoon, he said, well, I walked into the pits, and I went there and I gave them a mercy shot in the head. Boom, make sure they were dead. Boom, 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 boom. And he got out of his chair and stood up and walked over to me. I was sitting across the table. We were drinking red wine. He wanted to recreate the situation. Very often the people were given alcohol to drink before they went out and shot people. Well, he walks over to me and bends down and points to the middle of his calf muscle, just below the knee, and said, können Sie sich vorstellen, Herr Johnson, ich musste hier waden in dem Blut, und der Blut so bis hierhin. You know, Mr. Johnson, can you understand? I had to wade in the blood up to my knee almost of these Jews. Think what that was like. He says, können Sie sich vorstellen? Can you imagine? He said it 3 times. He got up 3 times to me. Können Sie sich vorstellen? Können Sie sich vorstellen? Können Sie sich vorstellen? Could you imagine? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? I don't know if I can imagine, but what I think he was saying is he was the victim. He's killing the Jews, but he had to wade in his blood. You know, get dirty. Could I imagine? I don't think he was showing remorse. My guess is by the late 1942, and especially by the beginnings of 1943, right after the Stalingrad defeat of the Germans, is when the German people would start to admit to themselves a kind of thing they were already hearing very often. Because now they started to believe they wouldn't win. Hitler could be defeated. Before that, he was undefeatable almost. But Stalingrad was a crucial moment, and in January of 1943, the German people started to become more sour. We know this from all kinds of opinion reports, from the Gestapo, from the from the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, and from other kinds of ways of measuring this opinion, that the opinion of the German people started to change. It became defeatism, and that became actually, well, it became treason, and you could actually be killed for spreading thoughts about losing. But I think with that recognition that was coming to them after Stalingrad, this crucial battle, that maybe Hitler was not a kind of false god, I mean, a kind of god, or a kind of successful person that would always be successful, then they started to realize and think about, what happens about all the things we've done here? And they started to have to come to grips with the horrible situation. Besides that, in December of 1942, this is when the BBC made a very strong attempt, right before Christmas, 17th, 22nd, I believe, I'm going to have to check my own book myself, to report in great detail about the mass murder of the Jews, because they knew that the Germans were listening very hard to hear about Stalingrad, and they didn't get much from their own propaganda ministry, their own radio stations. But the British, who are now, again, speaking in a German language, in perfect German, to the German people, and you could get it in almost every place. There were only a few tiny protests, I mean, of very courageous people, like the Sophie and Hans Scholl in Munich, and the White Rose group of medical students and their professor, and so on, and the other ones who spread these Flugblätter, these flyers, they called it, discussing that Jews are being killed. Okay, in 1942 and 43, this is a very small group of people that were part of this. There was also a Rosenstrasse protest I spoke about a little bit, which is the only really known open protest of people screaming in the streets against these actions, and it was mostly of the wives of Jewish husbands, the mothers of Jewish boys and girls, the children maybe of people that were not sent off. They were Christians who were married into a mixed Jewish family somehow, and it was their children being considered Jews and sent off, or their husband who was a Jew being sent off, or their relatives someplace. And they screamed, murderers, 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 in February of 1943, outside of where their husbands and children and so on were being held before being sent off to Auschwitz. And so there was, some people let out of, there's debate about this still in Germany, but there was some people, maybe 140, 50 people, who were let out, and what exactly happened to them all later, I didn't follow, honestly. Bruno Bettelheim, a famous survivor, and now dead, of course, and he also a child psychologist, but I remember many years ago, in the mid-1980s, I heard him speak once in the university in Michigan, and I was just sitting in the audience, and I hadn't yet studied what I'd studied. I had a PhD, but I didn't do all the work that I've done since about this. But he, at the end of his speech, and he was then, I believe, in his 80s, he said, it was silence that killed the Jews. The silence of the world, not just the silence of the German people. It was the silence that sentenced the Jews to death. The Germans were simply their executioners. And I thought this was, at the time, a little bit crazy, but now I don't think so much. That I don't want to spread the blame equally to people around the world, but sure, I mean, the Americans, the French, the Belgians, the Polish, the Russians, people around the British, whatever, all bear some responsibility somehow by not acting on information which they could know about. It's written in the New York Times. It's written in, of course, Jewish papers, but not just Jewish papers. It's written in the biggest newspaper of our country. It's written in the London Times about this. There's stories, you could know about it, and there could have been real protest here. Why not go stop this stuff? The American Air Force have been blamed for not dropping bombs right on Auschwitz, which maybe would have killed those people, but they were dying anyway, but then maybe saved many others.